Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Authors at Wharton. Adam Grant, organizational psychologist, Malcolm Gladwell, devotee. Really excited to be able to bring you all here. Just want to say a couple things before we get started. First of all, we will be doing moderated Q&A on Twitter, so any question you have at any point, use the hashtag WhartonAuthors. If you don't have a Twitter account, this is a good time to create one. If you have a Twitter account, but you don't want your question associated with your name, create a new account and then tweet it under that, or borrow the cell phone of your nearest friend and tweet in their name. A couple of people I want to thank. This is our Authors at Wharton committee. They've done an amazing job organizing the series this year and especially putting together this event. Huge round of applause for all of them. Preview of what's to come next semester. We're going to have A.J. Jacobs, my favorite humor writer, author of The Know-It-All and The Year of Living Biblically, talking about what happens when you reinvent your life to become someone that you're not. Then we'll have a humor expert on psychology, Pete McGraw, talking about what makes A.J. so funny. Then we will be bringing Dan Ariely of Predictably Irrational and Behavioral Economics fame to talk about his newest work on why most of us are liars. And then we will be closing off our external speaker series with Ariana Huffington, who will be telling us why we should care about success as more than just money and power. What other metrics should we track in our lives and our organizations? But today, I am absolutely delighted to introduce Malcolm Gladwell. There are many, many things we could say about him. We could talk about his mega best-selling books. We could talk about being named one of Time's most influential people. We could talk about the way that he shaped the conversation in every aspect of society, about the very choices we make in everyday life. I think what I would like to say about Malcolm Gladwell is two things. Personally, I had a chance to read The Tipping Point when I was in college, and it was the moment when I felt like I was not doomed to be a nerd, but rather, ideas could actually be cool. I think that Malcolm Gladwell, more than anybody else on the planet, got people interested in social science, got them thinking about evidence and how that could actually apply to their lives. The other thing that I think really stands out about Malcolm Gladwell is, in my view, he is the most spellbinding and nonfiction writer of our time. I think there's no greater storyteller on the planet. These are abilities I envy greatly, along with his hair. And with that, please welcome Malcolm Gladwell. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. That was a really lovely and warm introduction. Only partially true, but I'll take it. It's a pleasure to be back here at Penn. A couple years ago, I came here and I gave a talk about how you should all practice drinking and get better at it. And after giving that talk, I thought, there's no way I'm getting invited back. And then I was invited back, and I came, may have been in the spring, or maybe last year, and gave a talk about how you guys should all boycott your football team. And I denounced the Penn faculty and administration, and I thought there's no way I'll get invited back. And here I am again. So I can't say enough about the forgiving nature of Penn University. So I thought I would talk today about one of the chapters in my new book, David and Goliath. And it's a chapter about the troubles in Northern Ireland, the 30 years of conflict between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. And I tell the story about an incident that happened at the very beginning of that period, which was a curfew that was imposed on a little neighborhood in Belfast called the Lower Falls. And for an entire weekend, the British Army shut the neighborhood down and told everyone there that if they left their homes, they would be shot on sight. And in the end, the curfew was broken by a group of several thousand women, Catholic women, who were from a neighborhood up the hill from the Lower Falls. And they marched down the hill, arm in arm, singing, "We Shall Overcome." And they got closer and closer and closer to the soldiers with their submachine guns manning the barricades, until the soldiers finally blinked and ran. They just dispersed. And if you talk to people who are students of what happened in Northern Ireland, they will tell you that that moment was the turning point, the moment that the insurgency that would seized that country for the next 30 years really got started, and when support for the IRA really kicked in. And I wrote about it not because I wanted to delve into any great detail about who was right or wrong about Northern Ireland, but because I was interested in the broader question of why do people do that? Why do people who have no obvious advantages, no great power, no weapons, no anything, choose to confront authority in that way? And I think that's a question that applies to all kinds of different scenarios in the world that we live in today. And so that's the theme I want to return to this afternoon. What is it that inspires underdogs to fight? And I'm not going to go much further in telling stories from my book, because I know that the more that I talk about my book, the more I diminish your motivation to read it, which, why would I do that? So instead I thought I would do is tell a story that's not in the book, but which bears, I think, very directly on this theme. And maybe by exploring it, we can come to a better understanding of this question of why underdogs fight. And the story is about a very, very remarkable woman named Alva Smith. And Alva Smith is, I think, one of the most important figures of the 20th century. And when you look closely at her life, what's fascinating about it is that there is very little, at least on paper, to explain or suggest why her life took the turn it took. About midway through her life, she became a radical, a really profoundly important radical. And yet there is very little in her life to explain why she would have taken that extraordinary step. And so that's why I think she's such an appropriate topic for discussion if I'm exploring this theme, because maybe if we can understand why Alva chose to become a radical and confront authority, then maybe we can understand in general why people take that step. So Alva Vanderbilt, or Alva Smith, she has three names. Alva Smith is the name that she was born with, Alva Vanderbilt is the name that she became famous with, and Alva Belmont is the name that she dies with. She's born in the 1860s to a relatively well-to-do cotton merchant in Mobile, Alabama. And when she's quite young, her family moves to New York City, and she really grows up there. And as a child, she is best described as a force of nature. She is this ferocious, obstreperous, unruly, egotistical, problem child. She picks fights whenever she can with other people. She, especially if they're boys, she is completely uncontrollable. She's never more, even at adulthood, she's never more than about 4'11". She's this very, very severe face. A friend of hers once, trying to be nice, once said that she resembled a Pekingese. But this is actually not true. She actually resembles a pit bull. She has hair that goes all the way down her back that turns gray by the time she's in her late 20s. In her memoirs that she writes at the very end of her life, she says that she felt her whole life she was governed by this kind of inner force which caused her to pick fights with people. Because it's true, she really spends her time looking for people to confront. And when she can't find a fight to pick, she makes up a fight in order to then pick it. And as she comes of age in New York City, she has great plans for herself. And she realizes the only way she's going to accomplish those plans is if she has money. And so she casts her eye across the eligible young men of wealthy New York society until her sights land on a young man named Willy Vanderbilt, who is very handsome, very charming, very spoiled, and who just happens to be the grandson of Commodore Vanderbilt, who at that point is the richest man in the world. And Alva learns that Willie is going to go down to a spa in Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, and she follows him down there. And one night at dinner, she dresses up in this extravagant black dress festooned with goldenrod, and she comes down the stairs into the dining room. And Willie Vanderbilt looks up, and he is absolutely mesmerized by the sight of Alva. And Alva plants herself next to him, and she lies about her age, and she charms him, and sure enough, in short order, they are married. And she bears him a daughter and 2 sons, and then she sets about attempting to become the most conspicuous consumer in the history of conspicuous consumption. And those of us who have lived through the first 14 years, 13 years of the 21st century know that the competition for that title is considerable. The first thing she does is she buys 800 acres on Long Island, overlooking the bay, and she has Richard Morris Hunt, who's the most prominent architect of the day, build her this extraordinary house in shingles, overlooking the water. Then she buys an entire city block. She buys the corner of 5th Avenue and 52nd Street in Manhattan. She demolishes everything there, and she has a French chateau built, again by Richard Morris Hunt. And to give you a sense of what it's like, it costs $3 million in $1890, which is about a couple $100 million in today's money. And the best description of it comes from one of the many books that have been written on Alva Vanderbilt's houses, all of which are best described as exercises in real estate pornography. And I'm going to read you this description, which I think sums it up quite well. Everywhere was everything. Walls of red African marble, of stamped leather, walls hung with blue silk brocade, with red velvet embroidered with leaves, flowers, and butterflies, enriched with cut crystal and precious stones, ceilings of mahogany, of bronze, of colored glass, of bamboo, wainscoting of rosewood inlaid with mother of pearl and brass, ebony inlaid with ivory, polished ebony inlaid with satinwood, and Grecian, Oriental, Elizabethan, English, Renaissance, French, and Victorian touches in crowded rooms bursting with bronze, stained glass, marble, and mosaics. Then she decides she wants a yacht, and not just any yacht, the biggest yacht ever built, 285 feet. A yacht so big that one time when she's sailing around the coast of the coast of Turkey, the Turkish Navy confuses her yacht for an enemy cruiser and fires 2 shots across the bow. And she calls the yacht the Alva, of course. Then she decides what she wants is a country house. And so she goes to Newport, Rhode Island, and she builds herself a house there. And I won't go into any detail about that house except to say that she has to build a special derrick in Newport Harbor because she decides to import 500,000 cubic feet of white Italian marble just for the facade. So now she has the country house, the city house, the country cottage, the yacht, and her attention turns to her eldest daughter, Consuelo. Now, Consuelo was this shy girl, but Alva had raised her according to the very strictest of standards. And she, for example, required that her daughter speak to her parents at all times in French, never in English. On Friday afternoons, Consuelo was required to recite a poem in German from memory before both of her parents. She was forced to wear one of those old-fashioned corsets that had the metal staff up the spine and then another metal rod across the shoulders so that her posture would be perfect. And if Consuelo did the slightest thing wrong in any kind of public setting, she would be instantly corrected by Alva. Alva really has very, very high hopes for Consuelo. And as Consuelo approaches the age of majority, Alva decides that what she really wants is her daughter to marry into English royalty. Now this, in the late 19th century, this is quite a common occurrence. There were so many, in fact, wealthy heiresses to American robber baron fortunes who were married off to the penurious sons of the English aristocracy, that there was a term to describe this, which was cash for class. But Alva typically sets her sights on the single most eligible penurious son of the English aristocracy, who was a young man named Charles John Spencer Churchill, otherwise known as Sonny, who was the 9th Duke of Marlborough, the first cousin of Winston Churchill, and the lineal ancestor of Princess Di. And also, most importantly, the heir to Blenheim Palace, which was then and still is one of the largest private homes in the world. A palace so enormous that just the main buildings comprise 7 acres. And Alva learns that Blenheim Palace is falling down. It's in a state of grave disrepair, and that Sonny does not have the money to fix it up. And she realizes, the minute she hears that is her opportunity, that Sonny would in fact make the perfect husband for her daughter. Now, there are 2 problems with this idea. The first is that Sonny is not in fact Sonny. He's a completely miserable guy. His father was widely known as the least pleasant member of the English aristocracy in the 19th century, which, if you know anything about the English aristocracy in the 19th century, is saying something. He's most famous for, at one point in his life, over the course of his life, he sold off from his family's art collection 18 paintings by Rubens, 2 Rembrandts, 1 Bruegel, 8 Van Dycks, and a couple of Titians, just to finance various eccentric schemes in his backyard. Sonny's mother, meanwhile, was known as Goosey, and she was famously very beautiful and also very stupid. And she's best known for the practical jokes that she would play, all of which were best described as exercises in extreme passive aggression, such as she would place ink pots on the top of doors so that when her guests would go through the door, the ink pot would fall on their head. And then once famously, she placed a pink doll under the silver dish that was for her husband's breakfast on the morning after her husband's mistress, Lady Alsford, had given birth to his son. You never quite recover from parents like that. And Sonny did not recover. He was petulant, self-absorbed, malicious. In fact, Consuelo once said of him, and I'm quoting, his hands, which he used in a fastidious manner, were well-shaped, and he seemed inordinately proud of them. Now, I quote that because of the many, many thousands of words that Consuela would write about her inner life, about both her own life and about Sonny, that is the single nicest thing she ever said about him. The only other fact worth mentioning about Sonny is that his second wife, Emily Deacon, used to sleep with a revolver by her pillow in case Sonny came in to see her during the night. So that's the first problem with Sonny. The first problem, which is that Sonny is not Sonny. And the second problem is that Consuelo was in love with someone else. She had fallen for a young man named Winthrop Rutherford, or Wintry as he was known, who was everything that Sonny was not. This dashing, charismatic, handsome, great athlete, member of a fine, upstanding New York City family. And he begins to woo Consuelo. And on her 18th birthday, she receives via messenger a single long-stemmed rose with no note attached, but she doesn't need a note because she knows who it's from. And shortly thereafter, she and Wintry go for a bicycle ride along Riverside Drive in Manhattan. And Alva is, of course, accompanying them as a chaperone. And as they approach a turn in Riverside Drive, Consuelo looks at Wintry, and Wintry looks at Consuelo, and they quickly bike on ahead until they're out of sight of Alva. And Wintry turns to Consuelo and proposes marriage to her. Says, "Will you marry me?" And she says, "Yes, I will." And Alva realizes something's up, of course, and pedals as fast as her little legs can carry her until she catches up with him. And she looks into her daughter's eyes, and then she looks into Wintry's eyes, and she realizes something is up. And she says, "This can't happen." And the next day, she takes Consuelo and whisks her off to France. And Wintry starts to write letters to try and communicate with Consuelo, and every one of those letters is intercepted by Alva, and Alva makes sure her daughter never sees them. And then Wintry comes to Paris in an attempt to see his beloved, and Alva places a guard by the door so that Wintry can't actually see Consuelo. And then Alva takes Consuelo and whisks her over to Newport. And once again, Wintry comes to Rhode Island to see his beloved, but Alva keeps Consuelo locked up like Rapunzel in the castle. And finally, Consuelo has had enough. And she mounts the opulent marble staircase in the Newport mansion to her mother's extraordinary bedroom, which has, cherubs on the ceiling holding shields festooned with the letter A, of course. That's very smart. And she says to her mother, "You can't do this to me. I have a right to marry the man I love." And Alva says to Consuelo, "Yes, I can. You don't understand. You have to be a duchess. You have to marry this man." And the two of them have an argument, not just any argument, an extraordinary argument, right? The kind of argument that only two Vanderbilts could have. And finally, Alva just totally loses it because no one ever tries to stand up to Alva Vanderbilt. And she turns to her daughter and she says, if you marry that man, if you let that man ruin your life, I will shoot him on sight. And Consuelo knows enough about her mother to know this is not an idle boast. And she creeps back to her bedroom, and a kind of deathly calm falls over the entire house. And in the morning, there's a knock on Consuelo's door, and one of the servants says, "Your mother has taken ill." And then a couple hours later, there's another knock on the door, and it's the doctor who's come to minister to Alva. And the doctor says to Consuelo, "Your mother had a heart attack. That argument you had with her was so stressful that she has fallen gravely ill, and if you have another argument like that with her again, I'm not sure she's going to make it." And Consuelo realizes it's no use. There's no way she can win an argument with her mother. And so on November 6, 1895, New York City witnesses the most extraordinary wedding, perhaps before or since, right? The wealthiest heiress in the country, maybe even the world, is married off to the most eligible bachelor in all of England. And Alva hires 80 decorators to fill St. Thomas's Church on Fifth Avenue with flowers. And she invites every single rich and famous person in the entire country. And up and down Fifth Avenue, people are standing 5 and 6 rows deep from 72nd Street to 51st Street. There are barricades and cops holding the back, and every newspaper in the country has sent reporters. It's just a madhouse, right? And Alva, at the height of all of it, when everyone's settled, she marches up the aisle with her 2 sons by her side, and she's wearing this extraordinary blue satin dress with a border of Russian sable, and she stands at the front of the church triumphantly, waiting for the bride to arrive, and she waits and waits, first 5 minutes, then 10 minutes, then 20 minutes, and Consuelo doesn't show up. Why? Because Consuelo is weeping inconsolably back at home in the arms of her father. And finally they pull Consuelo together, and they trundle her off to the church, and they push her up the aisle, and the minister declares them man and wife, and Alva whisks her daughter and her new son-in-law back into the vestry, and they sign the marriage contract, which guarantees Sonny $1 million up front, and then $2.5 million up front, and $100,000 a year for the rest of his life. And then Sonny and Consuelo get into a carriage, and they go off down Fifth Avenue, and Sonny turns to Consuelo as coldly as he can, and he says, "You have 2 responsibilities. 1, to bear me an heir, and 2, to fix Blenheim Palace." And back in the church, Alva is looking out a window on the street, and she sees the carriage receding down Fifth Avenue, and a tear comes to her eye. Because here is this little girl from Mobile, Alabama, and now she is the mother of a duchess. It is the grandest and most triumphant moment of her life. Or so she thinks, because things are about to get complicated. Now, you can see, I think, why I said that Alva is an unlikely radical, because the kinds of people who spend hundreds of millions of dollars on houses and who deck themselves out in blue satin with a border of Russian sable and who marry their daughters off to English royalty are not generally considered to be candidates for radicalism, right? It would be as if one of the Kardashian sisters picked up stakes and moved to the Middle East and joined Hamas. It's a long shot, right? It's not something you would think would happen every day. So how do you account for this? Well, I think it's useful at this point to take a step back and to talk a little bit about the theories that we use to try and explain why people disobey authority, why they choose to stand up to those in power. One of the leading theories for many years is simply the theory of deterrence. And what deterrence theory says is people will stand up to authority, will disobey, will engage in acts of disobedience when the benefits of disobeying the law are greater than the costs. Right? So this much seems like common sense. There's a very famous example of this is the Montreal police strike of 1969. In 1969, for 19 hours, the police in Montreal walk off the job. And in that 19-hour period, Montreal descends into mayhem. It's like the Middle Ages. There's so many bank robberies, the banks have to shut down. There are gunfights in the streets, which is incredible because, I know this because I'm Canadian, we don't have guns in Canada. They must have gone to America, gotten guns, brought them back to Montreal so they could shoot each other, right? Total craziness. Why is that? Well, because the costs of disobedience when there are no police are zero, right? So in that sense, deterrence would say, of course people misbehave. Now, the problem with disobedience, with deterrence theory, though, as an explanation for disobedience, is that there are too many cases where it doesn't seem to work, where the way that we behave doesn't seem to follow the theory of deterrence. So, for example, think about paying your taxes, which is the most common act of obedience to authority that all of us are required to do on a regular basis. If you look at how honest people are on tax day around the world, you will see huge differences. So if in countries like Greece or Italy, the amount of tax cheating that goes on is enormous. The number of people who are willing to defy the law is quite large. By contrast, in the United States, the amount of cheating that happens on tax day is really small. The US is known or thought to have one of the most honest group of taxpayers in the world, right? So what would deterrence theory predict about that difference between Greece and the United States? Well, deterrence theory would say that if Americans are incredibly law-abiding on tax day, that must be because the costs of cheating on your taxes are really high in this country. So is that the case? No. To the contrary, the costs of cheating on your taxes in this country are really low. The IRS, if they catch you cheating on your taxes, most of the time you don't do jail time. Most of the time what they do is they require you to pay back what you owe plus a fine. Right? Now, your odds of being caught are also really low in this country. The number of personal tax returns that are audited in the United States compared to other countries around the world is really, really low. If deterrence theory really explained human behavior, then we should all be cheating on our taxes. Because you know what? You're not going to get caught. And if you do get caught, it's not going to be so bad, right? So as a result of the failure of deterrence theory to explain things like taxes, a group of psychologists have come up with a competing theory. And the competing theory says that what really matters is not the risks and benefits, the costs and benefits of disobedience. What really matters is whether people perceive the law is being administered legitimately. It's the legitimacy argument with respect to disobedience. People obey the law when they think the law is being administered in a way that strikes them as legitimate. Now, what does that mean? Well, there are three aspects to legitimacy. The first is we obey the law when we feel like we're treated with respect. And respect means that if I'm wronged, do I get the chance to stand up and be heard? Can I stand up and say, I'm not being treated properly, and will someone listen to me when I say that? We also obey the law when we feel like the law is treating us fairly, when one group is not getting a very, very different deal under the law from another group, right? If we think we're all in the same boat, we're inclined to go along with the law. Thirdly, we obey the law when we feel like the law is trustworthy, when you think that the law today is going to resemble more or less what the law will look like tomorrow, and there won't be some arbitrary U-turn in the middle of the night, you'll wake up and everything's different, right? If we think that laws are being administered according to those three principles, then we're inclined to obey the law. So why do Americans pay their taxes? Because for all of the complaints we have about our tax system, we think it's legitimate, right? Do you feel like if your taxes are too high, you can stand up in America, complain, and be heard? Absolutely. We have an entire party in America that is devoted to listening to people's complaints about how their taxes are too high, right? Do we think our tax system in America is fair? Yeah, it's pretty fair. The system we're under is pretty much treats all of us the same, except if you happen to be running a hedge fund. But that aside, it's pretty fair. Is our system trustworthy? Does it take radical, arbitrary U-turns in the middle of the night? No, it doesn't. It's pretty consistent. We know what the tax system's going to look like tomorrow and the day after that. Now compare that to Greece. Is the tax system in Greece respectful? Not in the slightest. No, their tax system is one of the most corrupt around, right? People don't think they have a forum, someone listening to them when they stand up. Is it fair? No, it's not fair. If you look at the Greek tax code, it's got special deals for all kinds of groups. Rich people have been able to buy their way, to have the law look the other way. I mean, it's riddled with all kinds of inconsistencies and loopholes. And is their system trustworthy? No, it's not. It takes U-turns all the time. Under those circumstances, if we had a tax system that resembled the Greek tax system, we wouldn't pay our taxes either. It doesn't meet the basic standards of legitimacy. So let's take this idea and bring it back to the story of Alva Vanderbilt and see if we can't use it to explain why her life takes this unusual turn. Here we have an unimaginably rich woman who goes around building enormous castles and marrying her daughter off into English royalty. It looks like she has no complaints whatsoever, right? But in fact, she does. Below the surface, she actually lives a life. She's occupying a place in American society that is incredibly narrow and oppressive. In the upper echelons of New York society in the late 19th century, wives had very few freedoms. They were allowed to give dinner parties. They were allowed to order around their servants. Sorry. Yeah, you'll appreciate that little Freudian slip. But they couldn't work. They couldn't get educations. They couldn't speak up and participate in public life in any way. They were basically required to keep their mouths shut and stay at home. Meanwhile, men, particularly wealthy men, could do whatever they wanted. They could get educations, they could run businesses, they could stay out all night if they wanted to, they could exercise every freedom. The world was run for them. You know, the men of New York society in those ages, they used to get on their yachts and go out for cruises and bring along fleets of call girls to entertain them. They would keep their mistresses in apartments in town. They would stay at their clubs all night doing God knows what. There were two sets of rules for men and women. If a man in that world wanted to divorce his wife, all he had to do was to allege adultery. If a woman wanted to divorce her husband, she had to prove adultery, and she also had to prove physical cruelty. And Alva's husband, Willy Vanderbilt, is exactly this kind of guy. Here is this wealthy playboy who's never had to work a day in his life, who has this gigantic fortune, who's handsome and charming. And what does he do? He has one affair after another, right? Meanwhile, Alva is required to stay at home and pretend that everything is fine. She might look like she's someone who has it all, but in fact, she was desperately unhappy. And she would later describe the years leading up to Consuelo's marriage as the worst of her life. She and Willy have begun to argue, and she's also met a man that she actually does love, a man named Oliver Belmont. But of course, she can't have an affair with him because men can have an affair, but not women. So finally, in an attempt to save her marriage, she turns to Willy and says, as a family, we should take a cruise. Let's go to Paris for the summer. And they go to Paris in an attempt to heal their marriage, but it has the opposite effect. The first thing that Willy does when they arrive there is he starts to have a very public affair with Alva's best friend. And then he takes up with this high-end Parisian prostitute named Nellie Neustatter and is seen all around town with this courtesan. And Alva is completely humiliated. And later in her life, when she writes her memoirs, there's this really poignant part where she describes what it was like to be a woman in that situation. And she says, let me read it to you. She says, "It was considered religious, dignified, and correct for the wife to withdraw into the shadows while her husband paid the family respects to the sunshine." And then she writes, and this is the line that I find heartbreaking, "The wife was supposed to get her sunlight by proxy through her husband." And I think that phrase, sunlight by proxy, helps to put a lot of Alva's behavior, curious behavior, into perspective. Here is this brilliant, driven, ambitious woman. And if she was living today, she would have gone out and started a company. She'd be an entrepreneur. She would have run for public office. She would be doing something that would satisfy her enormous energies. But in 1900, none of those options are available to her. There's only one thing she can do back then, and that is she can build houses, right? That's the only option that's available to her. And in retrospect, you can look at that and you can say, these houses were obscene objects of conspicuous consumption. But that is a very uncharitable reading. That's all she had. That's all she could do. That's the only outlet she had for her extraordinary energies. She needed a project and a challenge, and that's what her world gave her. Those houses aren't actually symbols of conspicuous consumption. They are symbols of frustration. I think it also makes sense of her seemingly inexcusable behavior over her daughter's love for Winthrop Rutherford. Alva loved her daughter. She had gone to extraordinary lengths when Consuelo was growing up to make sure that her daughter, unlike almost all women of that class in that era, had a real education, had access to real tutors, was able to see the world. What she wanted was an intelligent, outspoken, independent, worldly woman, right? Someone who could stand up and be counted in the world. And then she looks at Winthrop, and what does she see? Well, when Winthrop first starts wooing Consuelo, Winthrop is 33 years old, and Consuelo is 18. Winthrop is someone who spends his days playing golf and polo at the Newport Country Club. When he dies, if you read his obituary, it's really quite interesting. You realize the obituary writer is working incredibly hard to find anything interesting to say about Winthrop's life. And the best he can come up with is to say that Winthrop's fox terrier kennels were known the country over, right? Winthrop is a guy, when Winthrop couldn't marry Consuelo, you know what he does? He just marries the next rich heiress he can find. And then that rich heiress dies young, and what does Winthrop do? He marries another rich heiress. If I might paraphrase the immortal words of Mr. Kanye West, I ain't saying he's a gold digger, but I ain't seen him with no broke nigger, right? When Kanye to the rescue. When Alva looks at him, she sees a replica of the same man she married, Willy Vanderbilt, an idle, decadent philanderer who would sentence her daughter to a lifetime of misery and uselessness. By contrast, what is the Duke of Marlborough? Well, he's also a miserable guy, but at least he's a miserable guy in another country, far from the constrained, oppressive world of New York society. And at least if she marries him, she will be the Duchess of Marlborough. She will be someone who has a public position, who will be looked on with respect, who will be able to speak up and be heard, who will have a real position and real clout in society. You know, to our modern ears, that sounds like a horribly cynical proposition, right? Because Consuela was in love with Wintry, and we think you should be able to marry the person that you love. But to Alva, in that world in the 19th century, when a woman was no more than a property of her husband, love was an impossible luxury, right? Consuela was her great hope. Consuela was her beloved. She had a real mind and a very powerful spirit, and there was no way Alva was going to let her daughter squander her life in the same way that she, Alva, felt her own life had been squandered. So what does she do in response to these two, this situation that she's in? Well, the first thing that Alva does in those long, lonely years is she kicks her husband, Willy Vanderbilt, out of the house. She says, enough. You can't humiliate me anymore. And she demands a divorce. And of course, divorce in those years, particularly among the wealthy elite of New York, was unthinkable. And she is ostracized by her peers. She goes to the church where she's been going her entire adult life in Newport, Rhode Island. And people who she'd known for 20 years turn their back on her and won't talk to her. They pretend she doesn't exist. And her own lawyer, when she goes to him to try and file the divorce petition against Willy, he won't do it. He's like, it's improper. It's not right. She has to stand up and to finally demand that she has a right to distance herself from this man. She's vilified, and she's ostracized, and she's cast out of New York society. The next thing she does is that she stands up to her full 4'11" in front of her daughter, Consuelo, and she says, you can't throw your life away by marrying this ridiculous playboy. And then she marches up the aisle in St. Thomas's Cathedral, and she waits there for 10, 15, 20 minutes while every eye in the house is on her and while she's being an object of humiliation. And she knows the reason Consuelo's not there. She knows her daughter is at home weeping inconsolably in the arms of her father. And later when she stands at the window in the church and she watches the carriage pull away and that tear comes to her eye, that is not a tear of triumph. That is a tear of tragedy. This is a woman who is faced with some absolutely impossible decisions, right? And has had to make a series of incredibly difficult and courageous choices. She's had to divorce her husband and face the vilification of her peers because he's humiliated her. And she's had to alienate herself from the one person in the world who she loves more than anyone else, her own daughter, in order to save her. And why does she do it? Well, under normal circumstances, people faced with those kinds of incredibly difficult choices, they fold. They don't do it. They don't go ahead. They say to their husband, come back. I can't face the being ostracized by society. They say to their daughter, you go ahead and marry this guy. I need you too much. I need your love and support. But Alva doesn't do that. She stands up to the society that is judging her so harshly. And why does she do that? Because she does not accept their judgment against her as legitimate. They have not treated her with respect, right? She can't stand up and be heard in New York City 19th century society. She has not been treated fairly. They don't treat women the same as men. No, they got one rule for the husbands and one rule for the wives. And the world in which she's part of is not trustworthy. On the contrary, it's the furthest thing from trustworthy. So Alva, in that moment, is at that place, that point that all radicals are at the moment of their transformation, and that is that she's angry. Now, I said at the beginning that I wanted to try and understand what happened in Northern Ireland Why did underdogs in that situation choose to fight? Why did they choose to confront all the power that was arrayed against them? And I think that with this idea of legitimacy, we have the beginning of an explanation. Because when you deny people fairness, respect, and trust, and when you create that kind of anger, you put people in a frame of mind to fight. I think this is really what lies at the heart of what happened in Northern Ireland. The British Army came there in 1969, and their intention at the beginning was to serve as peacekeepers. Right? You had Catholics and Protestants who were at each other's throats. There were gun battles throughout Northern Ireland. There were Protestant mobs were roaming through Belfast, burning down Catholic neighborhoods, and the British bring in their troops to restore order. And in the beginning, it's very important to realize that in the beginning, they were welcomed with open arms. Everyone understood that they were there for a reason, and that their presence there was making the country better off. But something happened over the course of the first year that the British Army was in Northern Ireland that permanently soured the Catholics of that country on the British. And what that was that the reason was the British never understood the importance of this notion of legitimacy. The general who headed the British Army in Northern Ireland was a guy named Ian Freeland, and he was a general of the old school. He was this guy with the straight back and the square jaw. And he comes into Northern Ireland, and the first thing he says is that the army was prepared to meet force with force, that their patience was not inexhaustible. And he said his mandate was to deal toughly and to be seen to deal toughly with thugs and gunmen. Freeland was a believer in deterrence. He thinks the reason that people are misbehaving and defying authority in that country is that the penalties for disobeying the law were not high enough. So in the summer of 1970, he gets a tip that there are some weapons, illegal weapons, in a house in this little neighborhood called the Lower Falls. And so he sends a group of troops and police to the Lower Falls to search the house. And they search the house, and sure enough, they find a whole cache of illegal weapons. And they come out of the house with the weapons in their hands, and outside a group of youth have gathered, angry youth. And they start throwing stones at the soldiers and the policemen. And instead of leaving, as they should have, the soldiers stop and try and calm down, try and stop the violence in the crowd, right? Because they want to send a clear message that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. And so in response to the stones that are coming from the kids, they throw back tear gas. And the more tear gas the soldiers throw, the angrier the kids become. And the more people from other parts of the neighborhood come rushing forward. And things start to get out of control, and someone turns over a bus and sends it afire. And finally, Freeland has had enough, and he sends in a helicopter to circle over the neighborhood. He tells everyone to get back in their houses under pain of being shot. And he brings in thousands of troops and policemen, and they search every single house in the neighborhood from top to bottom. Right? And they find all these illegal weapons, and they clamp down the entire neighborhood. And in the morning, Freeland has a flatbed truck, and he piles it up. He puts all kinds of journalists and local politicians on the back, and he drives through the deserted streets of the Lower Falls, and he turns to them and he thinks he's solved the problem. He thinks the troubles in Northern Ireland are over. Why? Because he has sent a message that force will be met with force, that no amount of disobedience will be tolerated. And he really thinks that he and his army will be back in England by Christmas. But they aren't, right? It doesn't work. The violence in Northern Ireland goes on for another 30 years. And why? Well, think of it from the perspective of the people in the Lower Falls. Do you think that they were being treated with respect? No. This was the whole problem in Northern Ireland from the beginning. Northern Ireland was a country that had a Catholic minority and a Protestant majority. And the Protestants ran all of the important institutions. They ran the government, they ran the courts, the problem from the beginning in Northern Ireland was the Catholics did not feel that they had a voice. They didn't feel they could stand up and be counted. That's not respect. Was the system fair in Northern Ireland? That's the second condition of legitimacy. No, it wasn't fair. Right? Did the Catholics think that they were being treated equally with the Protestants? No. The army that was, the police force that Freeland was using to try and create order in Northern Ireland was 90% Protestant. Right? Do you think that when the people of the Lower Falls, the Catholics of the Lower Falls, saw the police coming, the Protestant police coming, that they felt they were getting an equal share, an equal shake from that organization? The same police force the previous summer, when there had been all these riots throughout Belfast, had stood by and watched as Protestant mobs burned down Catholic houses. Journalists had reported that some members of the Protestant mob would come up to the police officers and ask to borrow their weapons. Right? And why was it that the first neighborhood that Freeland chose to crack down on was a Catholic neighborhood? He should have cracked down on a Protestant neighborhood and a Catholic neighborhood at the same time. That would have appeared fair, but he didn't do that. No, he picked on the Catholic side. And when the Catholics of the Lower Falls looked through their curtain windows on the Saturday morning after their neighborhood had been shut down and saw a flatbed truck driving through the deserted streets with all these politicians on the back, who were those politicians? They were all Protestants. How do you think it made those people in the Lower Falls feel? They felt that they were being conquered, not like someone was trying to bring peace. Right? So after 2 days of the curfew, what happens? Well, the anger in Belfast starts to grow greater and greater and greater. And finally, a group of several thousand women at one neighborhood over up the hill decide enough is enough. And they get together and they link arms and they march down the hill and they get closer and closer to the British troops, and the troops panic and run in every direction. And I think you can see why that moment is considered to be absolutely pivotal in the history of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Normally, women and mothers with husbands and children at home do not march without any weapons on armed soldiers. But they do if they've been denied legitimacy. Because what happens to people who have been denied legitimacy? They get angry. And one of the mistakes I think that people in positions of power make is they forget what an unstoppable force that kind of anger can be. It took 30 years in Northern Ireland for the British to finally put that anger out. So back to Alva. The spark that ends up setting off the powder keg that is Alva Vanderbilt turns out in the end to be her daughter, Consuelo. Consuelo, in the years of her marriage to Sonny, ends up being transformed. She bears him 2 sons, as she would famously say, an heir and a spare. And the significance of that cannot be understated, because had Consuelo not born Sonny an heir, then the burden of Blenheim Palace would have passed to Sonny's first cousin, Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill, in all likelihood, would have been so consumed with keeping that huge barn afloat that he would never have been able to run for public office. And the Second World War would have been lost to the Nazis. And where would we be? So we owe Consuelo a lot. So after 10 years, though, Consuelo decides enough is enough, and she leaves Sonny. But she does so with such grace and dignity that everyone in English society rallies around her and supports her and considers Sonny properly to have behaved abominably. And with that divorce comes a transformation. And she has been locked up in Blenheim Palace all of these years, but now that she's free of Sonny, she starts to take a really important place in the public stage in England. And she becomes, in those years, one of the most powerful voices for social justice in all of England. She becomes one of the most important philanthropists in the entire country, someone who on one occasion after another stands up and becomes a powerful voice for a better world for the poor and the disadvantaged of England. And in 1908, Consuelo decides that she's going to return to New York City. And she comes back to New York, and she gives an incredibly famous speech. at the Waldorf Astoria before all of the most powerful New York society women of Manhattan. And what's extraordinary about this speech is that she does not mince words. Consuelo stands up and she basically tells all of these wealthy women that they're wasting their lives. She says, look, you guys have been standing behind your husbands. You've let your husbands tell you what to do. You've frittered away your energies and your time giving elaborate parties. You've been passive. You should look and see the way women behave in England. Because she says in England, women of wealth and position were one generation ahead. They realized that they could play a meaningful role in the way their society is organized. They realized they could stand up and be counted. And she says that basically to all of these assembled people, shame on you. And you can't imagine the effect this speech has. It sends this extraordinary tidal wave through all of America. It's reported on in every newspaper, and Consuelo becomes a kind of heroic figure. And throughout all of this incredible speech, who is sitting in the front row of the Waldorf Astoria arena? It's Alva, right? And you can only imagine the effect that this speech has on Alva. Because 13 years before, she had sent her daughter away in tears, right? Wrested her away from the man she loved because she felt that was the only way to save her daughter. And now her daughter is back in America, and what does Alva discover? That her daughter has been saved. And after the speech is over, Alva and Consuelo have a conversation together in the back, and Consuelo turns to her mother and says, you know, in spite of everything, I am glad I married an Englishman. And it's as if a weight has been lifted off Alva's shoulders. It's as if every one of the sins that she felt that she had committed over the course of her life had been absolved. And she thinks about what Consuelo said, and she realizes that Consuelo is right. And she realizes that she, Alva, has been too passive. She has been too willing to let her world dictate to her. Not long after that, Alva goes to England to visit Consuelo, and she goes to a speech at the Albert Hall being given by a famous suffragette named Emmeline Pankhurst. And the Pankhursts were the most militant suffragettes in all of England. You know, this was a time, of course, when very few women anywhere in the world had the right to vote. And there was the beginning of a campaign throughout the West to try and win equal rights for women. At the center of this campaign in England was this woman, Emmeline Pankhurst, and her daughters. And Pankhurst was ferocious. She was a piece of work. She would attack policemen. She and her followers would break windows. They would burn down houses, all in the cause of bringing greater acceptance for equal rights for women. And Alva listens to this woman, and she's mesmerized. She was like, this is my kind of radical, right? And she says later, listening to Emmeline Pankhurst was like a million atoms being hurled towards a solution. And she realizes that Consuelo didn't actually go far enough. It's not simply the case that women have been passive. When she looks at all the impossible decisions that she was forced to make over the course of her life, she realizes there's a deeper reason for them. And that deeper reason is there's something structurally wrong with American society. And she realizes that women will never have the right to stand up and be counted, to be treated with respect, to be treated the same way that men are treated, unless they win the right to vote. She realizes that without full equal rights for women, there will never be legitimacy for her gender. So she returns to New York, and she's ready for battle. And she looks at the state of the suffragette movement in America at that time, and she realizes that it's in a shambles. It has, there's no resources, there's no visibility, there's no energy behind the movement, and she realizes those are three things that she has in common, or three things that she has in spades. So what does Alva do? She does the same thing she's done her entire life. She just barges in and she takes over. And first thing she realizes is that the suffragette movement is headquartered in a small town in rural Ohio. And she says, this is nonsense. And so she buys them this extravagant headquarters on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan and says, we're moving to the city, right? And then she goes to her cottage in Newport, Rhode Island, and she says, I'm not interested in this as a summer home anymore. This would make a really great convention center for the suffragette movement. And she turns it into basically the meeting hall for the suffragette movement, much to the dismay of all of her fancy neighbors. And then she goes to Washington and she says, why don't we have a lobbyist? She says, this is ridiculous. So she goes and she hires like a whole lobbying team. And you would not believe the flack she takes for that. All kinds of people criticize her because they say hiring a lobbyist is not ladylike. And Alva doesn't care because Alva hasn't been ladylike in about 40 years at this point, right? And then in 1909, the female garment workers of New York City go on strike. And it's a very famous strike because the garment workers of New York are the most abused, underpaid, downtrodden group of workers in the entire city. These are the people who work in the most appalling conditions. And they go on strike in 1909, and they are treated abominably by the police. The police illegally arrest the picketers and tear the clothes from their body and take them back to prisons where they're physically assaulted. And the whole thing is a complete outrage. And Alva sees this, and she says, enough. And she steps in, and she leads a parade on behalf of the strikers down the Bowery, and she hires a 6,000 person hall for a fundraiser for the jailed strikers. And then she goes and she sits in the courtroom where the judge is ruling on the case, and she stays there all night staring at the judge until finally he has enough and he lets them out of prison. And then she turns to the African American community, because back then, of course, there was a separate African American suffragette movement, but black and white didn't mix, so they were off doing their thing over here, and the whites were doing their thing over here. And Alva says, this is ridiculous. We're all women. So she invites the African Americans to join the movement. And when people in the suffragette movement say, you know, Alva, you're moving too far and too fast, you're being too aggressive, you're going to antagonize men, Alva stands up and says, men never worry about antagonizing men. Why should we worry about that? And then during the First World War, there's a whole group of suffragettes who say, you know what? While we're fighting this war, we should cease and desist. This is no time for us to be standing up and arguing for equal rights for women. And Alva hears this and says, this is absurd. This is exactly the time we should be standing up and fighting for equal rights for women. And Alva makes sure that every day that America fights in the First World War, the picketers outside the White House stay there and make their presence known to the president. She puts every ounce of her dictatorial, domineering, egomaniacal, controlling, manipulative personality into this cause. And you all know what happens, right? August 18th, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution passes, and the women of the United States, for the first time in this country's history, have the right to vote. And the lesson of that victory is as powerful today and as important today as it was back then. And that is that if you deny people legitimacy, they will, by one means or another, come back and defeat you. Now, there's one last thing. Alva dies in January of 1933 from a stroke, and her funeral is held in St. Thomas's Church on Fifth Avenue, the same church where Consuelo was married so many years before. And it's just like Consuelo's wedding. It's a mob scene. People are lined up and down Fifth Avenue, and the police are holding them back, and there's a line of limousines, and it's the most extraordinary funeral people have seen in years, and 20 of the most important feminists from around the country are her pallbearers, and they carry her body into St. Thomas's, and then the funeral service begins, and the audience, the congregation sings 3 hymns. The first is a hymn written by that famous suffragette feminist hero, Harriet Beecher Stowe. The second is the suffragette battle song, which was called The March of the Women. And the third is a hymn that was composed by Alva herself. And it's a beautiful epitaph to the life of this extraordinary woman. And the hymn is all about how when Alva gets to heaven, there is no way she's going to allow a man like St. Peter to stand in judgment of her. And it begins, no waiting at the gates of paradise, no tribunal of men to judge. The watchers of the tower proclaim a daughter of the king. Thank you.
Thank you. Where to begin? The Twitterverse is exploding with references to Malcolm Gladwell and Kanye West.
How is that not one of the greatest couplets of all time?
We're waiting for him to quote you in his next song. But a question from James Townley on a serious note. Do you think disobedience theory has any relevance to explaining Kanye's behavior?
Oh. No, I had not expected that they would take that turn. Well, you know, this is totally parenthetical. I have enormous respect for Kanye West because I do think that he has, over the course of his career, demonstrated again and again and again his willingness to take chances, not just musically, but also with his reputation, in a way that I think is really interesting and important. That he is not, fundamentally, he's someone who does what he wants to do without reference to going along with social convention. And for an artist, that's very admirable behavior, I think.
No commentary on Miley Cyrus, but...
Yes. I said an artist.
So a related question. Anger obviously motivates these extraordinary acts of, in some cases, sacrifice, in other cases, social change. What differentiates good anger from dangerous or extremely radical anger?
I don't know whether you can differentiate between the two. So the same dynamics that I described today, I was describing the case of an insurgent, Alva, who used her anger for good purposes, to make the world a better place. There are many instances in the world where people choose to use the power that comes from anger to make the world a less good place, or at least make the world a more troubled place. The mechanisms are the same. The ends that people choose, all we can do is hope that at the end of the day, more people channel their disobedience in a positive direction than a negative direction. But, you know, the terrorists who attacked on 9/11 were motivated by deep-rooted anger, right? They felt they were treated illegitimately. Whether or not they were justified in believing that is a separate question, but that's how they felt, and they chose to do something enormously destructive. So what I'm describing here is an objective set of circumstances that lead people to do disobedient things. And my hope is simply that people like Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King are the preferred path for those who feel they've been treated illegitimately.
On the flip side, Petra Nichols wants to know if Alva is motivated to promote social change. Why doesn't it happen earlier? Why doesn't she start philanthropy instead of building these conspicuous buildings? And is she not angry enough, or is there more to it?
She doesn't get angry until a couple of things happen. I think her humiliation over her treatment by her husband is so pronounced that I think it's only then that she wakes up to how narrow and constrained and oppressive her world is. I think in the beginning, she's spending money and having a grand old time. And then I think when Consuelo gets married, she's forced to confront, through the eyes of her daughter, how oppressive her world is. I don't think it occurs to her until it comes time to figure out what should happen with her daughter's life, that her daughter has no options, right? I mean, the only way that she wants her daughter to be, she has grand ambitions for Consuelo, and she realizes the only way I I can create a situation where my daughter can actually have a voice in the world is to send her to another country and have her marry a complete jackass. And that's, I think that really wakes her up to how empty and oppressive her world is. Until then, I don't think she realizes it.
Does that make vicarious anger more powerful than personal anger?
I don't know the answer to that question. It's a good question. I don't know the answer.
Neither do I. Let's move on. So a number of people want to know, including Katie Milkman, where you find your stories and how you choose what's not only interesting to you, but interesting to the world. So I think Alva's a great example to look at. How did you find that story, and how did you decide it was one that you wanted to tell?
I forget why, but there's a huge, late 19th century, Gilded Age New York society is the most bizarre period, matched only by our own period, which is, by the way, we will look back on as being incredibly bizarre, for the same reason, which is these moments in history where an exceeding amount of wealth is held by a very small number of people. Strange things happen. But what's interesting about the Gilded Age is that there's a large number of people who were involved in this incredibly insane, frivolous moment in American history who choose to write memoirs about their time. So you can go on, to some used book site and order, there's about 5 or 6 of them, they're all fabulous, of, so-and-so socialite who did nothing but go to elaborate parties for their entire life between 1880 and, 1929. Will write these memoirs that are unbelievable. You can't. Anyway, so I don't know why, but at a certain point in my life, I just read them all because they're really interesting. There's one in particular that is fantastic anyways, I won't go into it. But that's the one where a woman gets married to a guy, and the guy turns to her on their wedding night and says, just so you know, not only do I not love you, I don't love women. And they stay married for the rest of their life. Anyway, you stumble across Alva in these stories over and over again. And she's such an extraordinary figure. And I found her most people find her appalling. And I found her the opposite. I actually find her kind of heroic, even though she's appalling. But people who are heroic are often appalling at the same time. That's kind of why part of what makes them fantastic.
All right, so I guess another question that's coming up a lot is the question of whether you might join Twitter conversations more frequently. So there are a lot of people interested in what you read, what you're exposed to. How do you decide how often you tweet?
Well, I've tweeted 40 times, thank you very much, since in the last 4 months. That's pretty good. That's 10 times a month. Mostly those are retweets of my friend Tim Long's jokes online. They're pretty good. My problem is that I find, I write books that are 80,000 words long, and then someone comes along and says, I'd like you to say something interesting in 142 characters. I'm like, I'm not used to that. Also because I don't think I'm very good at it. My mind doesn't work that way. I don't come up with little pithy, and also it's a time sink. People who tweet a lot don't do anything else. And I'm going to break something to you. You don't get paid for tweeting. No one pays you for tweeting.
All right, that's fair. I think there are a few tweetable quotes in there, though. So I guess another question that has raised at least some interest in debate is this question about chicken and egg with the IRS. So is it the case necessarily that because it's easy to get away with cheating, people don't, and fairness is a part of that, or does causality work in the other direction? Is it possible that, in fact, we don't need tight controls because nobody cheats in the first place here in the US?
Oh, that's interesting. It is, when you say, then we need to explain, quote, no one cheats, right? So you're still back with this question of, what do you think is the normal baseline activity when a large government body asks for, say, 40% of your income? To say, sure, or to try and find ways to get around it. I think it's more, I think that you still have to, I think that human beings
their baseline is to cheat. And so when they don't cheat, you have to come up with an explanation. So that's why I haven't considered the obverse. And generally looking around the world, American tax compliance, as it's called, we're so honest on tax day. It requires a special explanation. Nobody, only the Swiss, are as good as we are on tax day. So it's so weird that I think you've got to do it better. And also there's been, I must say, the tax literature is enormous on this. And there are lots and lots and lots and lots of experiments that have been done that support the notion that it's legitimacy comes first. Right? So there's some reason to believe that. It's not just me sitting in my apartment in my underwear who's decided to interpret it that way.
So Nicole Woon asked, you were recently asked if you could ask anything, what would you ask God? And your response was, did he have any regrets? And I'd like to point out that God responded to that question. No, actually, the real question is, have you had any regrets? So if the question were turned around on you, what are they?
Oh my God, so many. How much time do we have? Who doesn't have regrets? I think I regret, I had a big chocolate chip cookie at lunch. I regret that chip cookie. I mean, it was not a good idea. Sitting in the bottom of my stomach. Tons of regrets. I don't know where to start. I'm generally not someone who thinks that their life has turned out in an optimal way. So I basically regretted everything I've done since about 14. I would much rather still live in Canada, have a 9-to-5 job, have a large number of children. You know, that's the life I think would have been better. This is a default.
So on Canada, you've generated recently a solution to that problem, an exchange program of sorts. Could you share that?
I was telling you this. I told Adam this when we were backstage. This is my grand solution to the world. I have a number of them. This is one of them. So what we do, you have normal process of immigration, where you apply, blah, 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 it takes 10 years. That continues to go on as planned. But then you also have an exchange that is run by a third party, whoever it is, Microsoft, I don't know, Google. It's international exchange. And what you do is, if you want to leave your country for another country, you just post, it's like Craigslist. You post on the exchange, I am Malcolm Gladwell, I have these educational credentials, I'm this years old, and I would like to move to New Zealand. And what happens is, if someone else in New Zealand matches your credentials and wants to move to America, you just match and switch. And no government has anything to do with it. It's just a straight up trade. You lose Malcolm and you get a Malcolm look-alike from New Zealand. No one's upset about it. You're not losing, it's not brain drain because you're getting an equivalent brain from the other country, right? There's no red tape. It's really simple. It's just a simple match system online. Because there are lots and lots and lots of Canadians who perversely want to move to America, and lots of Americans who, for very good reasons, would like to move to Canada. Let's make this happen. And by the way, you can go around the world. How many people in this room right now, if given a chance, if it was totally seamless to do, would move to another country for 2 years? Raise your hand. Thank you. How great is this idea?
All right, so another question that provokes a lot of curiosity is, you draw heavily on the social sciences, especially psychology and sociology, but also others. How did you first become interested in doing that, especially with a father who's a math professor?
Well, having a father who's a math professor inoculates you against ever doing math. I never understand people who go into the same profession as their parents. It's like, there's nothing good comes of that. It's like, particularly if you think I don't know, but my father was, I felt, a reasonably successful math professor. So like all of a sudden, I've just set myself up for failure if I wanted to be a mathematician. No, I began to read, I was at the Washington Post, and the only place to be in the Washington Post is on the national staff. That's the prestige place. And I couldn't get a job on the national staff. except if I was going to become a science writer, because no one wanted to be a science writer. So I was like, I'll do that. So I became a science writer, and I was at a loss to what to write about. And so I would go to the library, and I began to read the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology.
Yes.
Which I believe you have made your home in recent years. Adam owns and operates journals like that. And I was so struck by how much cool stuff, like genuinely cool stuff was in it, that I'd never heard anyone write about. And so I just fell in love, and I used to get it. For years I convinced them to send me a free copy. And I would read it every month, and then I would spend huge amounts of time in the library, the local, actually I was in DC, so I went to the American University Library. And I just was amazed, like, the thing about academia is, and you all know this because you're in it, that there is a mountain of incredibly cool thinking that goes on that never sees the light of day beyond academia. And so I just became a groupie. And I've been a groupie ever since. But it was because I needed something to write about as I became a science writer.
Do you start with the story or the study, or does it go in both directions?
It goes in both directions. Yeah, well, it just depends. There's no kind of system. It's just a kind of very haphazard.
And when you think about your books to date, I think every writer has a book that they think somebody else should write, a topic, a question, a story that needs to be told, but you are not going to be the person to do that. So in case there's someone sitting in the audience, what is that book?
That I want someone else to do?
Yes.
Oh, that's really interesting. I've actually never thought about that. I think that there was a psychologist who was actually who taught at Penn, named in the 50s and 60s, who I mentioned in passing in Blink, called Sylvan Tompkins. Sylvan Tompkins? I have a bad memory. I think it's Sylvan Tompkins, who sounded like the most remarkable guy ever. He was so interesting. He's the guy who first mapped the human expression, the human face. And he was one of these kind of fantastic characters who, gambled large sums at the track and, was the greatest storyteller of all time and wrote a book that was so dense and complicated and in so many volumes that no one read it, but everyone considers it a work of genius. One of those kind of best case scenarios, like where maybe because you can't understand it, you think it's a work of genius. Anyway, I always wanted someone to write like a proper biography of him. I've talked to a number of people and there is something called the Sylvan Tompkins Society in Philadelphia, which is devoted to kind of plumbing the depths of his incomprehensible writings. But I think those kinds of people deserve biographies.
So imagine that in an upcoming election, you end up becoming the president of a large government, say Canada or the US.
Yeah.
What's the first policy change you would make?
Well, so many. I think that my biggest problem with both Canada and the United States is that they are based on an antiquated notion, which is that in the 18th century, there was a reason to be a big country because you were constantly fighting all kinds of battles. There is no reason to be a big country anymore. In fact, there's lots of reasons not to be a big country. So the first thing I would do if I was an American president is I would try and convince America to break up. It's just too big. Why do you want to be so big? Everyone hates you. Because you're big, you have to do all these things and shoulder these responsibilities that are not worth it. And two, you have a government that can no longer function. Why? Because you're not one country anymore, right? You're at least four. So if I was, New York City should be a nation state, like Singapore. Why not? Deadly serious. Should be. Makes far more sense. The rest of the Northeast should really join up with Canada. There's no reason, if you're Massachusetts, why are you not part of Canada? It's crazy. You should be. And also, Canada should slice off the upper Midwest. You're trying to tell me that the Dakotas and Minnesota don't belong with Canada. Of course they don't. The South, one country, all by themselves. And then the West. Hello? California, Oregon, Washington, that's one country, right? Makes sense. Then everything is like, then you have common currency and stuff. And, I suppose you still let Homeland Security persecute us as a general principle. But everything else, you have your own, you run your own show. So much better. Canada should be two countries. That whole piece with America here, and then Alberta, and should go off by itself. But this is, once you think about it that way, it's like, oh, that makes sense. And then every country should split up. Why is Italy one country? It's a stupid 19th century notion, right? Southern Italy, one country. Milan, etc., another country. And you could do this throughout the entire world and everything. London, a nation state, right? It's dragging the rest of England down or up, depending on your perspective. So that's one thing I do. And then I would have a series of discrete reforms that I would do. I do my exchange idea. I do my don't ask, don't tell idea for, this is not a big idea, which you guys are not going to be interested in, but I think is genius. This is my one-sentence reform of higher education in America. Ready? Don't ask, don't tell on the name of your undergraduate institution. So what this says is, you can go to any college you want, we're not stopping you, but you can never divulge the name of that college, and nor can anyone ever ask you the name of your college. So just think about that for a moment. Would you still have gone to Penn if, upon graduation, the world would never know you went to Penn?
I fear that some alums would lose the ability to speak.
That's
but
right. Yeah. You can no longer, that's right. It's like I always think that whenever I meet someone from Harvard, that if you were to take off their shirt, they would have a large H tattooed on their chest. That would have to stop.
So in closing, let's do one more question, since we have a lot of undergraduates and graduate students in the audience. If you were going to highlight one piece of advice that you wish you had received over the last couple decades, back to when you were an undergrad, what is it?
Oh, wow. I was in way too much of a hurry to join the workforce. I realize it's different now, because I went to college in Canada when my tuition was, my tuition up until my senior year was $800, but then they raised it in my senior year to $801. And we picketed the administration office in one of, I still remember at the announcement that tuition had gone up, someone yelling from the back when the dean announced it was going to be 801. That's highway robbery. The thing about, so I didn't have any debt, unlike a lot of you. It's really hard to have debt when your tuition is $800. And so, but the thing about that is you have way more options, right, upon graduation. So that's sort of different, but I really regret, A, rushing into the workforce. I regret not leaving North America. That was a huge mistake. I should have gone, the time to go and explore the world in a meaningful way is when you are in your early 20s. You will never have that opportunity again. I wanted to go, I had an idea that I wanted to go back, my family is partially from Jamaica, and I wanted to go to Jamaica for a couple of years, and I didn't for a number of random reasons. That was the stupidest decision I ever made. I really should have gone. It would have made me a different and a better person, and it would have broken me out of the, if you read my books, you'll realize that with some exceptions, I am consumed with North America. Almost every example is in North America. That's a problem, right? You can't describe the world. If you want to do as I do and write about the things that matter to human beings, you cannot do that if your frame of reference is the United States and Canada, right? 90% of the examples in my books are about the United States and Canada. That's the biggest problem with them. And that's because of choices, bad choices I made when I was young. If I had gone away and spent 5 years outside of North America, or 10 or whatever, I wouldn't have the blindness to the rest of the world. We are a tiny speck in the world. I mean, we have all the money, but that doesn't mean we should only talk about what happens in this part of the world. And that's an error I made. Hopefully I'll try and correct it at some point. But.
Well, in closing, if we're to start the Malcolm Gladwell exchange program, we have to ask for one exemption, which is we're not allowed to lose you from North America.
Oh,
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it. Thank you.